And we're live. What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us. You may notice we have a little bit of a different camera setup today. Still testing it out. Let me know how you like it. It should be higher definition, but I feel like the screen's a little too wide. But anyways, chat, let me know. We have a very exciting episode today with Yossi Klein Halevi. For those who don't know, Yossi Klein Halevi is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. In this episode, we're going to explore Rabbi Menachem Froman's groundbreaking vision for peace, known for his efforts to unite Jewish and Palestinian communities through faith. Rabbi Froman's legacy is brought to life in a newly released book, Chasidim Just Laugh. This remarkable collection of his teachings highlight his radical approach to Jewish-Arab relations, offering profound insights into peace, joy, and religious coexistence. The foreword of this book was written by none other than Yossi Klein Halevi. That's why we felt he was the perfect guest to have this conversation. Also, for those who have not read Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, it's one of the best known and most inspiring books on the conflict, so highly suggest picking it up. You can find links to both Chasidim Just Laugh and Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors in the description. Yossi, great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me, Adar.
So Rabbi Froman is somebody who I've actually been personally inspired by for many years now. Unfortunately, never got the chance to meet him, but you were a personal friend of his. So I'd love to know just a little bit more about your relationship with the late Rabbi Froman.
So he was my mentor in reconciliation work, specifically in how religion can be turned around from being really the great impediment, or one of the great impediments to peace, to being an impetus for peace. That was really Rabbi Menachem Froman's vision, and he lived it. He embodied it. So he was my mentor, my rabbi, my friend, my sparring partner, my debating partner. We argued pretty often about politics, and I felt very often that he went too far, until I began to realize that Menachem's categories weren't political at all. He didn't think in political terms. He thought in messianic terms. And, messianism has become a really negative word, especially in Israel and especially in relation to the conflict. Messianism is seen as feeding the appetites for annexation on the Israeli right. Messianism is seen as driving a certain arrogance, spiritual arrogance, and all that is true. But Menachem Froman gave us another model for messianism. And it was really taking the core meaning of messianism, which is world redemption, which is recognizing the interconnectedness of all of reality, the oneness of reality, and not just as a political slogan, but as a lived spiritual reality. And that was Rabbi Menachem, to look at every human being and see God's image. The book of Genesis, it's written that a human being is created in the image of God, and Menachem lived it. He genuinely saw God's image in Hamas terrorists, and so we used to argue a lot about that because I was not on his spiritual level. I didn't have his spiritual vision. And he said to me at one time, he used to tease me and call me Rabbi Yossi, and I am not and never will be a rabbi. But he would say, Rabbi Yossi, don't you see all of the beings of fire that are standing behind us and helping us to make peace? And I didn't see them. And I thought he was speaking metaphorically, but I'm not so sure. I think he really might have actually seen these beings of fire.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's often thought that settlements are an obstacle to peace and settlers are an obstacle to peace. And Froman kind of broke that in many ways broke that stigma. And, there are many that followed his path. The organization Roots also is a group of settlers that are dedicated to coexistence. But it's interesting to see that, you have on one hand a level of extremism we often see in the settlements, and now you're describing a different level of extremism in his optimism and his ability to see God in everybody and the human in everybody, and it's beautiful. And it seems like if this can become a more popular movement in that segment of society, then the situation on the ground would be very
Well,
different.
Adar, what's really interesting, just listening to hear you describe Menachem, who, of course, was a settler, not just a settler, he was one of the founders of the settlement movement. And he, excuse me, and he was the rabbi of a settlement called Tekoa, which he helped found until his death. So if you were to tell an outsider, and I've had this experience, so Israel's leading religious activist for reconciliation with the Palestinians and with the Muslim world generally is also a settler. It's one of the founders of the settlement movement. People don't know what to do with that. It doesn't compute. And Menachem was one of those characters that makes sense in an Israeli context. He carried so many paradoxes in himself, and in another context, it would just seem incoherent. But because he was really a man who really lived in a kind of altered state of consciousness, he lived in a world that was, in his mind, in some sense, already redeemed. He was living in messianic reality. And so all of these contradictions were resolved somehow. And he believed very deeply that the Jewish people not only has the right to live in all parts of the land between the river and the sea, but spiritually, in order to fulfill its purpose in the world, had to live in all parts of the land. But at the same time, he believed very strongly in a two-state solution. Now, this made him on the one hand, it made him an active settler. On the other hand, it made him kind of a pariah in lots of settlement circles. So he carried these contradictions, but in his mind, they weren't contradictions at all. Yes, of course, I believe that the Jewish people needs to live in all parts of the land of Israel. So do the Palestinians. And there needs to be a different way of governing God's land. It can't just be the same politics as usual being applied to God's land. So he wasn't a conventional leftist. He wasn't a secular Tel Aviv leftist. He really was a settler. He was arrested during the 2005 Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. He was arrested protesting the withdrawal. Jews should be living in all parts of the land from the river to the sea, including Gaza. And today he would probably be supporting rebuilding settlements in Gaza. So in some ways, he was way to my right, and in other ways, he was way to my left.
Right.
And where we finally met was in this commitment to trying to use our religious faith, like Menachem, I'm a religious person, to see whether religion can be what it's supposed to be, which is a transformative way of living. It's a way of sharing something of God's consciousness, of looking at reality through divine eyes. That's the mystical approach to religion. And Menachem was a mystic in his deepest essence.
So, I have a lot of family members that are settlers. And it's really gotten me to just better understand how your views don't necessarily determine the type of person that you are, right? So if you look at their political views, they're all quite extreme. I think you could even conclude that many of them are racist towards Palestinians, but they're also some of the kindest, most hospitable people I've actually ever met. And it just goes to show the complexity of the human, how we could be so kind, so loving to those who we perceive to be in our in group, but if somebody's perceived as a threat, we seem to look at them differently. It really helped give me compassion towards people on both sides of the borders who I am in fundamental disagreements with ideologically.
Yeah,
And
it's
and
interesting you're saying that, because I think that's something that Palestinians and Israelis share generally, is this sense of being incredibly generous and warm to your in group,
yeah,
and showing the hardest face possible to the out group.
right. Yeah, and if we could somehow just build a situation that we see all inhabitants of the land as our in group, we will see peace. And I guess that was Froman's vision, and that's something we're uh, working towards here with this content. As and it seems like we're farther than ever before to achieving that, but all we could do is continue to try to aid in the reconciliation process and humanize the other side. Um, my settler cousins, many of them think the work I do is quite naive, but they do often reference Froman as, they're like, oh, well, he's doing what Froman was doing. He's in the same line of thought. So it almost gives them a little bit more comfort in what I'm doing. So I have a little personal relationship with him in that
Right,
regard.
right.
You had the privilege of traveling with him a bit, right? And meeting with Palestinians. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, in the late 90s, I went on a journey in Palestinian society, specifically into uh, Islam and Christianity in the West Bank, in Gaza. And it became the basis for a book I was working on, which told that story. It was called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. And Menachem is a major figure in that book, because part of that journey uh, was spent in his company. We were pilgrims together. We went to mosques. Uh, we went to Gaza together, which now is, of course, inconceivable. But being with Menachem was really kind of experiencing his alternative reality. It was experiencing this land, God's land, the way it might be when it's a kind of a model for God's presence in the world. And so, when you were with Menachem, you just had to let go. And I live a very kind of schizophrenic life. I have my spiritual life, my inner life, my reconciliation work with Palestinians, with the Muslim world. But at the same time, I live a very definite Israeli life, which places me on one side of the line. And Menachem somehow managed, in a way, far more successfully than I can, to, on the one hand, be totally open, and to live in the redeemed world where there are no differences, it's all God, and at the same time to be a totally committed Israeli and to be part of the Jewish story. And never for a moment would he think of God forbid, of challenging the validity of the story. And somehow he was able to finesse the tensions between those two polar ways of being. I can't. So this last year has been extremely difficult for me, because I've gone into protecting Israel mode. And that's what
Mhm.
I've done in my writing, in my public speaking. And I don't feel that this is the time for reconciliation work on either side. The emotions are too raw. One has to respect the pain on both sides and step back. And at the same time, I'm not a UN observer to this conflict. I'm a part of it. So yes, I'm deeply committed to Menachem's vision of religious reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, Islam and Judaism. And at the same time, I feel like I'm fighting for my life now, my people's life.
You know, I've seen what you just described is something I've seen many people go through. You know, conflict has the ability to radicalize us. Trauma causes us to see things differently. And you know, this past year has been one of the most challenging years in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and it's, I imagine, been the hardest year for Palestinians ever. And it's
for
hard.
both sides. For both sides.
Yeah,
it's the hardest year.
Yeah.
The hardest year.
The reason I framed it that way is because we have thousands of years of persecution and pogroms and Holocaust that I didn't want to try to compare that. But
right.
With all this pain, it's very hard. It's harder than ever to see the other side. And, you know, I'm seeing people in my life who are deeply compassionate people lose all ability for empathy for the other side because of what is currently going on. And it makes me sad. I don't blame them. I certainly understand it. On a personal note, my reaction was quite different. I don't feel like it really changed me all too much. It just motivated me to. I want people to still have hope, because once we fall into despair, that's when violence ensues. You know, when we see that there's no other option,
right,
we start to look towards violence. So, for me, it's just the very minimum is, let's just keep talking. You know, let's have conversations. Let's try to bring people on from different perspectives who can engage respectfully. And I recognize very well that it's just a tiny drop in the bucket of what needs to be done, but it's really just my small part. And I think, on another note, maybe that helps me work through the pain and everything going on, feeling like I could do something. But I certainly
it's very important. It's
Yeah.
very important what you're doing, Adar. But
Thank
I'll
you.
tell you, the way that this has played out for me personally is that I really try to keep my heart open to Palestinian suffering, to not shut down. And I recently became a grandfather for the first time, and I look at my granddaughter. Thank you. And I think about, you know, Palestinian children, Palestinian babies. And that's in some way, that for me is the most visceral way of maintaining that basic, simple human empathy. But I no longer, or at least for now, I shouldn't say no longer, for now, I don't feel open to hearing the Palestinian narrative. Now, that's different from empathizing with Palestinian suffering. And I think the reason that I find myself so unable to open to the Palestinian narrative in a way that I once did is because my narrative, the Jewish people's story, our return home, is under such sustained assault around the world that when your story is being torn apart and being called a lie and a fabrication, historical fabrication, it's very hard to maintain a sense of empathy with the counter narrative that's trying to displace your story. You know, and in the end, for me, I mean, of course, this is a war over land and resources and holy places, but it's also very profoundly, maybe even at the root of it, It's a war of stories. It's a war of
Mhm.
narratives. And I've made an attempt in the past for many years to understand the Palestinian narrative, to respect it. That doesn't mean agreeing with it, but certainly to give it a place in my own work, in my own head, to give the Palestinian voice a place in the mix of voices that I hear when I try to sort through the conflict. And I can't do that now. It's not available to me.
Yeah. Um, you're just having a very human reaction to, you know, something horrific that happened. And I I'm so glad that you're able to share this perspective because you articulate it so well. And generally, when emotions are high and the pain is deep, when one tries to express what you just did, it comes off as delegitimization and dehumanization. And I feel like you articulated it in a way that's very easy to understand and empathize with. So thank you
Well, I
for that.
appreciate that.
So the book Chasidim Just Laugh, what can people expect in this book?
The total unexpected. Menachem comes across as a kind of a hybrid Hasidic Zen master with a tremendous sense of humor, as many of the Hasidic and Zen masters had. He comes across as enigmatic, playful, sometimes vehement and angry, and he had that. He was very angry about how much of the Orthodox Jewish community treated him, how the settlement community often treated him as a quasi outcast or at best an eccentric. And he used to say that, this is in the book, that in the Orthodox world, it's much worse to be controversial than to be a thief. You know? And so I'm mentioning that because Menachem had an edge. He was a Jewish Zen master, which means there was an
Right.
edge there. And what's so interesting about Menachem, and you'll find this really in Rav Kook, who was the great 20th century uh, Jewish mystic, and is this deep conflict between his universal messianic longings to just live in a world of oneness without any borders or distinctions, and what I mentioned earlier, his deep connection to the Jewish story. And this I think is one of the themes that runs through Chasidim Just Laugh, which is a beautiful connection. And I really want to thank Deuteronomy Press. They did a beautiful job on this book, and I'm just so grateful to them for bringing Menachem to an English-speaking audience, and very grateful to have been asked to write the foreword. I feel really deeply honored to have been able to do that. And for me, in some ways, it's closed a circle in my relationship with
Mm.
Menachem. So the book is it's short, it's very accessible, very readable, and what also I think makes it a Zen slash Hasidic reading experience is that it's deceptively simple. You read something and it'll seem cute or sweet, and then you think about it and you say, "Whoa, there's actually an edge here. There's another level to what he's saying," and it requires several readings, I think, to really get to the profundity of what Menachem was trying to reach, the state of consciousness he was trying to reach. he was really going for broke. He was going for the highest messianic state of being.
Right.
In the middle of one of the world's most brutal conflicts, and completely misunderstood by almost everyone around him.
So, for those just tuning in, if this book intrigues you, which I think most viewers of this channel, this is exactly the kind of book you're looking for, you could find a description for that, a link to that in the description. And yeah, the way we actually got connected. So, one of our viewers, I don't know if he wants me to shout out his name, so I just won't. But one of our viewers reached out saying that he's writing this book and that he'd like you to come on because you wrote the forward, and that's how it all happened. So, it's cool to see how viewers become friends, connections are built, things happen. We do have a fair bit of questions that I'd love to start getting to. So first of all, Levy Katzman gave us a $2 super chat. Thank you, Levy. We will prioritize the super chats. I always say if we get super chats when we have a guest on, then whenever we meet, this will be a budget to lunch. So we now have 8 shekels to split between the two of us for lunch. We could maybe get a few falafel balls to start, but
That's a start. That's a start.
Maybe we'll get a few more super chats. But so we'll start with Levy. Thank you for the donation. He wrote that he's a huge fan of yours. And then he has a question for Yossi. In his book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, he writes about 3 role models in his youth and their relationship with non-Jews, Meir Kahana, his father, and a third individual whose name escapes me, who jump-started the movement.
Yaakov Birnbaum, the founder of the Soviet Jewry protest movement.
Okay. There we go. The third individual believed that the world at large rejected anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. Does Yossi still believe that?
No. Yaakov certainly didn't believe that. He was very realistic, but he did believe that the Holocaust created an opening for a new way of relating to the Jewish people in the world. And certainly October 7th and the aftermath has challenged that sense of hope that many in the post-Holocaust generation had. I had it very strongly in the aftermath of the fall of communism. I was working as a journalist in those years, and in 1989, I happened to be spending the year in Europe, and the Berlin Wall fell, and I began spending a lot of time reporting from Eastern and Central Europe. And that was a really redemptive moment where you felt this tremendous evil force, this totalitarian Soviet Union, just imploded. And suddenly there was this feeling of release and unlimited possibility. And it was a really, messianism seems to be a theme for us tonight. And it was a very messianic moment. And as a result of that, the way that I expressed it was I really felt that with the fall of the most anti-Semitic regime in the world at the time, which was the Soviet Union, maybe there's a new opening for the Jewish people. And then came the second Intifada, the years of suicide bombings in the early 2000s. So my optimistic period didn't last that long, but I still carry something of that experience. I think anyone who was in Berlin around the time of the fall of the wall had to, in some basic way, be transformed, because what you saw there was this seemingly cursed nation, Germany, becoming the vehicle for world transformation and doing it in a totally bloodless way. And ever since then, I've never been able to relate to Germany in quite the same way. I come from a Holocaust survivor background, and Germany was always kind of untouchable for me. And so I can't say whether the world has changed its attitudes toward the Jewish people, whether the Jewish people has changed its attitudes toward the world, but what I've lived through and what I've seen changed my understanding of the Jewish place in the world. And even though we're going through a really bad period, the Jewish people and its relationship with the world, I'm not going back behind ghetto walls, and I'm not despairing. And neither are you, Adar. That's why you're doing this work.
Yep. Amen. So we have another question. We have a question now from Serena Shohet. Shout out to Serena. She's actually one of the original interns for this channel. And this message is coming through WhatsApp. So she's flexing her connections by sending this directly. Shout out Serena. She goes, what are we giving up if we say that this is not a moment of reconciliation and that we will save reconciliation for when the moment is less raw? What happens in the meantime? Is it dangerous to assume our feelings will eventually thaw and to just wait? To who is it dangerous in the short term? To who is it dangerous in the long term? So there's a lot of questions here. I don't want to, but
it's great questions.
Yeah. I'll also pop this up on the screen by sharing it myself, and then we'll be able to bring it up on the screen if you want.
Serena, I think that you're asking a really important question, which is, can reconciliation ever be deferred? And I don't know. I can only answer honestly about what it's like being in the middle of this thing now, and how I just don't have the energy for reconciliation now. That's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I said earlier that I feel like I'm fighting for my life. I'm fighting for my country is fighting for its life, for its legitimacy. And that's what it feels like. We're surrounded by genocidal enemies. Israel is being called a genocidal state. When I look around at the enemies we're facing, that's where I see the real genocidal impulse. And we're fighting. It's not a war against the Palestinians. It's a war against an Iranian regime with proxies all along our borders. And in order to do reconciliation effectively, you have to do it from a place of truth. And you can't engage in wishful thinking. And I can tell you that on the Israeli side, and I suspect pretty strongly on the Palestinian side too, there's very little space right now for genuine, deep reconciliation work. And that's a tragedy. That's I'm not saying in any kind of glib way, oh, we'll just put this on the shelf for now. Will it still be on the shelf when this war is over? Will it be available for us? And I think that's really in some way what you're asking. Can reconciliation be put in deep freeze and then unfrozen? I don't know, but it's not a theoretical question. It's a lived process. And there are times when one just can't do it. If you're in the middle of a war, and I am in the middle of a war, we all are here, you just can't do it. And I try to maintain my human connections, my personal connections with Palestinians. It's very important to me. And I am trying to keep those up. But to tell you honestly that, nothing has changed in my relationship with some Palestinians, I can't say that.
That actually reminded me of something quite interesting. So the name of this channel is Sulha, which is an Arabic word for to reconcile. And I didn't expect this when choosing the name, but not all Palestinians are okay with this name. They're offended by it. And what they describe is they're not in a place right now where they're ready for reconciliation. There's too much pain, too many injustices, and reconciliation is the next step. So what you're saying kind of, in a sense, reminds me of that.
That's it. It's on both sides.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's not we need to be in a certain emotional and mental state to be able to reconcile. And whether we're engaging in the reconciliation process or we're just activists for a cause, there's a cost to that. There's a toll. It's not easy. So, one of the areas I'm at odds with many Western activists is they almost have this expectation that everybody else will join their cause. And if not, there's kind of this shame that comes along with it. It's kind of a trend I've noticed in many of the Western activist spaces. And, one of the main reasons I'm not on board with that approach is because there is a cost to putting yourself out there and engaging with challenging ideas or people with different opinions. It's tiring, it's draining, and it's not going to be a priority for people who have other things going on in their lives. So I think we need to be very understanding that whether it's activism or reconciliation, at your own time and at your own pace.
I have no patience for hatred, but I think one needs to respect the pain, the deep pain on both sides. And when Palestinians say that it's not the time for Sulha, and I'm telling you the same thing, I think that well-intentioned outsiders need to take a step back, and you can't force reconciliation on a situation that's so dynamic and so broken. And I do believe that out of this brokenness something positive can happen. Not that it will, but it can happen. But that also requires the right moment.
Maybe we'll read this next one as not a question, it's more a comment. Maybe it'll lighten things up because it's, I don't know if it's funny, but so we have many viewers who view this because they respect the work and this process. Some not so much. It's more so there's a confrontational element that they're intrigued by, but they're not happy with me or this platform. So one of them, Omar Greenspan, good to see you here, is commenting. He doesn't have a question, but he wants you to know something important. Yossi, you said it very well. We should have empathy to all, including our enemy civilians, yet it is hard to be available to that when your history is attacked constantly. And then he goes on to say, unfortunately, you're talking right now to a man who titled his latest video, "In Israel Destroys Zionist Propaganda," which is true. I did do that. Are you still okay talking to me?
Well, I don't think you're an enemy of Israel, Adar, are you? That's not my impression.
I guess it depends who you ask, but I guess that this came from a place. I don't blame people. I say I won't blame humans for acting as humans otherwise would. I more so focus on systems, institutions, governments. So I've been very critical of the Israeli government. I've been very critical of Hamas. Some people, though, expect this blind, this blind support no matter what happens, and any form of condemnation is seen as like a traitorous act. So that's when I'm at odds with
Yeah, yeah. So look,
so, yeah,
Adar,
he called me a
you
cop
and I,
because,
disagree about a lot of things.
yep, I
And,
imagine.
before I came on, over the last weeks, we had some back and forth about Norman Finkelstein, who for me is beyond the pale. And in answer to the question you just read, I would not do an event with Norman Finkelstein. The fact that Adar has a soft spot for Norman Finkelstein is troubling to me, but he's not Norman Finkelstein. And what I appreciate about what you do, Adar, and the reason that I wanted to be on the show is because you're trying to inhabit a space that Menachem Froman did, which is somehow a transcendental space. And again, when it translates into hard political reality, it doesn't always play well, that position. And that was my argument with Menachem. But what I feel the value, we need people who are going to take risks and are just going to say, you know what, this conflict is so intractable that I'm just going to create a forum and just open this whole thing up. And that's what you do, Adar. And that's, for me, that's not a political act. It's a spiritual act. It's a religious act. I don't know what your religious position is. I don't know if you have a spiritual inclination, but for me, the model that you've created is spiritual. And the thing about Menachem that his critics, his Jewish critics, didn't understand was that really he was trying to do a different move. He wasn't playing in the usual confined political spaces. He was trying to just break the whole thing open and bring a greater consciousness in, which is God. And God holds all contradictions because God holds all things. And Menachem was trying to hold all the contradictions of this conflict. And what I see you trying to do, Adar, is something similar. Now, again, I can criticize the way that plays out sometimes because, and this was my ongoing argument with Menachem. I said, okay, you're living in a messianic space. You're already in the messianic era, but what you say and do has political consequences. So when you legitimize Hamas, I understand that you're doing it from a place of, you're looking at every human being through God's eyes. But we're in the middle of an existential war, and and there are lots of people who don't understand where you're coming from and think that what you're really saying is Hamas is okay. And he never said Hamas is okay. But so I think that that's part of the tension of approaching a brutal political reality from a spiritual perspective. And I struggle with that all the time. How do I remain truthful to the political truths that I know and to the spiritual state of consciousness that I'm aspiring toward? So, and for me, the mystical reality is the reality that I try to live much of my life in, but not all of my life is in that space. I also live in a brutal political reality, and I don't know how the two go together. And Menachem didn't know either, and his response was, "Well, Chasidim just laugh," which is a very Zen. If you think about it, it's a very Zen
right, yeah.
to the conflict.
So thank you for that, and Omri, internalize that, reflect on it. It's interesting because you asked briefly about my spiritual beliefs, so I consider myself to be agnostic. I don't have an active belief on any of these metaphysical concepts like God or the afterlife or karma. I'm certainly open to all of that existing, and certainly way more exists than we can see, feel, or hear. So there's a whole world out there that we don't know, but I just accept that I don't really know. That said, I'm trying to think, and yet we have still, Froman and I think we reached similar conclusions, and I think it's probably deeply rooted in the idea that human life is valuable. And I think if that's an assumption that we're going to agree upon, then often the conclusions we're going to reach are similar, regardless of if that's just a secular humanist belief or if it comes from something more godly or spiritual.
Well, I think that is certainly a good basis to. Are you still there?
Yep.
I lost the visual here for a moment.
Yeah, I'm here.
I think that's a great basis for some kind of shared commonality between a religious and a humanist perspective. Menachem took it at least one step further, which is it's not only that every human life has value, and he would say, of course, it has value because we're created in the image of God. We're actually not animals and we're not random. randomly created creatures. We actually are purposefully created and imprinted with the divine image, which is a whole other move. But he took it even one step further than that into a mystical teaching, which is that all of reality is ultimately one. And we're all made of the same stuff. We are all of the multiplicity that we experience. You're in that body, I'm in this body, and you have a name you've been given, I have a name I've been given, and we're two different beings. The mystical experience, and it's not an idea, it's an experience, is that oneness is not a theological idea. It's a reality. The whole world actually is interpenetrable. And I personally believe that this is where science is going to take us. Science is actually going to prove that all of existence is that the multiplicity on some level is an illusion. And so Menachem was coming from that place of mystical insight. And I believe he had that insight. He had the experience, not just the idea, the mystical idea, where you get these flashes of enlightenment, where you actually know, you experience the interconnectedness of all of life. And when you come from that place, then these aren't ideas anymore. It's a lived experience. And that's when I read this book, Menachem's book, and listen to his voice, and you just hear him. It's such a wonderful book. You hear him; he comes so alive again. What he's saying about God and humanity and peace and the Jewish people and the land of Israel and the Palestinians and the Israelis, it's coming from experience. It's coming from something that he really lived. And they're not just ideas. And I think that's what's also so special about this book. And generally, when you encounter mystical wisdom that's not just intellectual, but experiential, it has that power to transform your life, the way you see existence. And
yeah. So we'll try to get to two more questions. I know we got to wrap it up on the hour. One is actually from Deuteronomy Press. They are the ones that put out this book. So obviously we need to
great press, you guys.
Great
really
press,
I've been looking at your catalog. You guys are just doing beautiful work.
Deuteronomy Press goes, perhaps a rude ideological level, the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, is the epicenter of the conflict. How did Rabbi Froman's radical mystical messianism conceive of this spiritual geography?
Well, it was really at the heart of his radical peace vision, his radical religious peace vision. And it extended to the whole of Jerusalem. He wanted to declare Jerusalem under the exclusive sovereignty of God. And, I used to say to him, okay, it's a great idea, but what if God doesn't manifest, doesn't exercise his sovereignty in Jerusalem? You're creating a void. Somebody's going to step in and fill that void, because we're still in a pre-messianic political reality. So, but, Menachem really believed we are heading toward the messianic era. No, in fact, he believed we're already deeply into the later stages of the messianic unfolding. And so it's just a question of imminent time. And so he was ready to take tremendous risks that I personally was not. And for me, the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, needs to be left the way it is for now. which is under Islamic sovereignty. It is my holiest place. When I pray, I face the Temple Mount. It's not the Western Wall. It's the Mount. But the Mount has been under Islamic control for 1,300 years. And those Jews who want to upset that status quo are playing with fire. And certainly Menachem would have agreed with that, but he would have he tried to take it a step further and say the Temple Mount should be the capital. Jerusalem is God's capital in the world, and the Temple Mount is the seat of God. It's like God's parliament in Jerusalem.
And final question, who knows, maybe we could squeeze one more in, but potentially the final question. Poppy asks a question for Mr. Halevi. What does he want Palestinians to understand about Israelis and Israelis to understand about Palestinians?
That what both sides do is put the worst nightmares of each people onto the other. And we do that in the way that, and it's not just the Palestinians, it's much of the Arab world, much of the Muslim world, which sees Israel and the Jews as Western colonialists. And many Israelis, especially after October 7th, see Palestinians as Nazis. And each people is expressing its deepest fears and traumas through this conflict. And when it's crusaders and colonialists on the one side versus Nazis on the other, there's no solution to that conflict. Colonialists and Nazis will kill each other. One side will prevail when the other side is completely destroyed. That's one possible scenario for this conflict. And so what I would like both sides to understand is how each side understands itself and not how each side is perceived by the other.
Right. That's beautiful. And you bring up a very important point that I've been mentioning more and more, just seeing where we are. There's a lot of people who have a very zero-sum outlook. They are fighting for a total win, whether that's let's just use a clear example of the land remaining whole. It's entirely Israel or entirely Palestine. And this is a battle being had, and one side very well may get their wish. It's unclear who, but those pushing for the zero-sum solution are risking their side losing it all.
It's a very good insight.
Yeah.
I think that anyone who waves the banner from the river to the sea, whether it's on the Israeli right or the anti-Zionist left, is really saying the same thing, which is that one side is going to dominate and eventually destroy the other. Because there is not going to be a beautiful, happy, pluralistic, democratic state between the river and the sea. You have two very strongly national, two very strongly identity people, deeply rooted in their particularity, and they're not going to forfeit their identity for some Western idea of a happy binational state. And so what you're advocating is permanent domination of one side over the other. The only difference between the Israeli right and the anti-Zionist left is which side you want to dominate the other, to destroy the other. And I have deep dread. It's more than fear, it's dread of a two-state solution. I have a deep fear of a Palestinian state on the West Bank turning into another Gaza. It's a nightmare. But the only thing that frightens me more than that is from the river to the sea.
Yeah, not it's if there was a very clear path forward that would speak to our fears, concerns, hopes, and aspirations, it would be much easier to mobilize people towards that. But there really isn't a clear vision that both sides look at and are like, you know what, that makes sense. Let's do it. And it's on one hand, I think lack of strong leadership, maybe a lack of imagination, but whatever that solution is that both sides can get excited and feel comfortable with, that's the solution we should be looking for.
Okay, Adar, I can go for another 10 minutes if you'd like.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're more of a two states guy. Somebody did ask, I think it was also Poppy asked, what do you feel about like a confederation solution? It's kind of like European Union model.
I look, the European Union model won't work because Israel needs defensible borders. We can't have permeable borders here, and at least not in the foreseeable future. This conflict is too deep. There's too much mistrust. You can't just transition. You know, it now it's true that Europe did transition from an existential conflict from World War II into the European Union, but it did so when one side was completely destroyed. That was Germany. Germany was completely defeated. It's not going to happen this time. Neither side is going to be completely defeated. So I used to favor some kind of confederation, certainly since October 7th, when Israelis understandably will be desperate to maintain defensible borders. I don't see any possibility for a solution that doesn't account for that.
And it very well may be the case that the initial solution is not the same solution. Like we could work towards other solutions once we have a level of trust and reconciliation. It seems like often solutions are proposed that, if they're implemented on day one, would be an absolute disaster, but after a generation or two of healing, they very well can work. So I think it's important to be able to distinguish between day one solutions and year 10, year 20 solutions.
The all-purpose response for that is God is great. And however that plays out, Elohim Gadol, you know. And yeah, that's let's bring Menachem into this for a moment and say, you know, God also has a say in how this is going to turn out.
We have a question from Elaine Fishman. I actually really like this question. Elaine asks,
As opposed to all the other questions. That was a joke.
Okay, yeah, you put me on the spot now. Everyone has great questions. Elaine's hit is great plus interesting in a unique way. Not to take away from anybody else's. Elaine goes, do you see any possibility of Israeli cinema as approaching this reconciliation?
I think Israeli cinema, all art, has a role in reconciliation. Anything of the spirit has a role in reconciliation. I'm not particularly connected to Israeli film or to film generally, but I do live very strongly in Israeli music, and I think Israeli music has a very important role to play.
Agreed. I always talk about how can we build some kind of a shared culture and a unified narrative, and film, music, sports.
I don't think we're going to build a unified narrative. I don't think that's possible, at least not in this generation. But what I'm hoping for, and this is what my letters book was really trying to do, is to create a space where we could at least hear each other's conflicting narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can reach that point, then I think we really will have achieved something great.
A unified narrative very well may not be a day one solution, more so after a generation or two.
Yeah.
I tend to agree. But film and media can play a role in creating that reality, and also showing more about. I think one of the challenges is both sides don't have uh, such a realistic and accurate understanding of the other. Right? We hear about the worst in each other's society. Their experience with us is meeting settlers or soldiers or experiencing bombs we drop on them. Our experience with them is terror attacks, what we hear in the news, what our politicians say. Um, Pop culture, like film, can create a situation where millions of Israelis and Palestinians are exposed to the story of the other in a way that creates understanding and potentially even empathy. I think there's immense power there. I don't know if Fauda, I didn't watch that, but I don't know if that achieved that to any extent, but that's an interesting
Well,
case study.
Fauda did in the sense that it was wildly popular in both Israel and the Arab world. And I think that the reason it was popular in the Arab world is because it tried to humanize both sides. It didn't present stick figures. And humanizing doesn't mean prettifying. Humanizing means presenting human beings in all of their messiness and complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Fauda does it brilliantly. We think of humanizing, we're going to show the nice face. It's not necessarily
No,
that.
yeah, right. The ugliness as well, yeah. If anything, you mentioned my fondness of Finkelstein. If I reflect on one of the reasons why I would say I tolerate him is because of how complicated of a human he is and how he was raised by deeply traumatized Holocaust survivors, and he's on the autism spectrum, and he's just this just such a unique person, and then he kind of has this part about him that he's kind of like a troll at the same time. And we have our fair share of disagreements, don't get me wrong, but like I look at him and I'm like, that's just complicated man. Let's talk, let's see what he's all about.
Well,
And I
how
definitely
how about
understand.
how about if we agree that he's somebody who deserves pity and not a platform and not public indulgence? He's
I
such
hear that.
a deeply wounded
So
and hateful person. He's full of rage and hate.
yeah.
And why give somebody like that a platform?
So my perspective on platforming, and it's something I've really thought about and internally debated for a long time. I'm okay to platform pretty much anybody as long as I feel like they're not going to come just to, as long as I feel like they would come to speak in good faith, and if there's going to be pushback, right? So like, I'll give a clear example. We very much set this up as like an interview style. So even if I notice an area of disagreement, I'm not really challenging you in this interview. It's not a debate, it's an interview. But I would never agree to just bring in somebody for an interview if they had dangerous views. So I would never just give Finkelstein an interview like this, or even a settler an interview like this. I would only agree to platform them if I was allowed to um, to push back and debate. Now, with someone like you, I know that even all our disagreements, say whatever you want. There's nothing hateful, nothing harmful. I don't feel a moral obligation to challenge you, right? So I have like a different criteria and yeah.
I hear that.
But
Yeah.
I've had anti-Semites on, right? Like I'd never let them come on without a challenge. But yeah, I think I want people to understand their perspective. What is it about this belief
Well,
system?
I think Finkelstein has trafficked in anti-Semitic
Oh yeah, oh
motifs.
yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. Yeah. And let's just end it on bless his soul. Bless his soul.
Bless everyone's soul.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And one of the I believe deeply in the idea of reincarnation, which is also a Kabbalistic idea. It's in Hebrew. It's called Gilgul Neshamot. It's a very beautiful expression. Gilgul is kind of the rolling of souls. And if you think about what the deeper meaning of reincarnation is, it's that everyone eventually is given enough opportunity to keep coming back till you get it right. And the soul is the cumulative repository of all of our incarnations, all of our experiences. And so if you kind of blow it in one incarnation where you devote yourself to rage and hatred and grievance, don't worry, there's another roll of the soul coming. And eventually all souls will be enlightened. That is a very basic spiritual belief. And so if you apply that admittedly grandiose idea to the conflict, but really we're talking about Menachem Froman, so of course we're allowed to apply grandiose ideas to the conflict. Right. The idea of reincarnation really means take the long view, and the long view is a very long view. It's that each incarnation is another stage of human development. Maybe for some people this incarnation is their childhood. Maybe some are older souls, and this incarnation is middle age. Maybe for a very few rare souls, and maybe Menachem was one of them, this incarnation is your final incarnation. It's the incarnation of breakthrough into enlightenment. And so that also is a way of protecting. And I try to remember this, not always very successfully, but it's a way of protecting oneself against hatred. Because how can you hate another person who's just in the middle of, you're catching that person in the middle of the progression of the soul, and wait to see what happens a few incarnations down. And so,
right,
and that's maybe that's a good way to end.
It's like
this with Menachem.
If someone's having a bad day, it's like we should be understanding. So some people are having a bad gilgul, meaning
they're having a bad life.
Yeah, like we need to understand that. Okay, fair. I tend to agree. And who knows? So he might come back as the next Dalai Lama for all we know. That'd be interesting.
If you've had a bad life, chances are you're not coming back as the Dalai Lama. That will take a few more. You need to have a few good lives, I think, before you come back as a Menachem Froman or a Dalai Lama.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, Yossi, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
It's great to be with you, Adar.
Yeah, and maybe we can plan another one in the future.
Sure. I'd be delighted to do it. And thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being part of Adar's community. He deserves your participation, and you're really trying to do something beautiful, Adar. So thank you.
I appreciate that so much. And for those who want, you can find more information on Yossi, his website, as well as buying the book Chasidim Just Laugh. That's all in the description. I'll stay on for like another 10 minutes to answer some questions. But Yossi, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Great to be.
Okay, wow, that was Yossi Klein Halevi. What a convo. Thank you all for tuning in. So yeah, we have this new video going on. So the screen is so wide. I just need it will require so much more cleaning before every live stream. Okay. Find an excuse to clean. Excuse a minor disorganization in the background. There's been a few questions. Critical Thinking Over Doctrine says, thank you for your work. Thank you for tuning in, Jewish PS. says this was wonderful. Great to hear. I always love when there's people who I don't recognize. Like we have our usual commenters who I recognize, and it's kind of like a little community, but it's also always awesome hearing from new people. Comment from Jordan, who I think is also new. Also Elaine, I'm not sure I've seen you here, so welcome. If anybody's new to the channel, we do weekly content, talking to people from opposing views, primarily Israelis and Palestinians. Sometimes we have an occasional anti-Semite on, although it's been quite some time. I'll sometimes do commentary. Even if you don't like my commentary, there's still a lot more here besides just my views. This channel, although I run it, is not about me. It's about bringing people together for these conversations. Let's see what questions we had. Levy says you had a whole discussion on Fauda. You haven't watched it yet. No, I actually did not. Well, I've seen part of it, but that's actually like our third most watched video or second most watched video. It was Zahir and Danny did a like 2-hour conversation reviewing Fauda. But interestingly, the average watch time is very short. It's like 30 seconds. So I think the title is very intriguing. People click on it and then it's not what they thought, so they click out. Omar, are you still here, buddy? Omar Greenspan? This was such a beautiful conversation. I don't want to get into anything heavy right now, so I'm not going to go on all the claims of I'm going to say maybe one thing on related to war crimes, because Yossi is saying, and I think it's important, not Yossi, sorry, Omri. It is something I've noticed people have challenged me on or gotten upset with me on. My views haven't really changed all too much since October 7th, but we're dealing with a new situation. So people are seeing me respond to a new situation, which is October 7th, right? We've never experienced something like that. And what Israel's response in Gaza has been since October 7th, which I've been very, very critical of. Now, I kind of want to break down, without getting stuck on this too much, but Omar, you say that there's no war crimes being committed, and then you say that when we need to band together, I'm speaking about the war crimes. So there's just two separate arguments, and I just want to clarify them, and then we'll move on. One is a question of if war crimes are being committed. That's not debatable. We know they are. And you could also justify by saying it happens in every war. I think that we're seeing an unprecedented amount of war crimes, and I think we have ample evidence of this. I'm putting out a report this week on it. So that's not even something that's debatable. We could debate the extent of them. Are they justified? Do we need to care about it? And your other point, I do think, is worthy of debate, right? You're saying now's the time to band together, and I'm criticizing Israel, right? That's not, now we're not dealing with objective reality anymore. This is an opinion, and I hear your opinion, and many other people share this opinion, including my mother, who has given me feedback on the criticism I've been sharing about Israel. There is this idea that now's the time, the world is against us. The last thing we need is an Israeli, a former IDF soldier, a Jew speaking against Israel. I hear that. I get it. The reason that I feel differently is, I guess, two reasons. One is just a deep moral obligation. I don't think any country, any person should be blind or should be protected and shielded from criticism, even if they're under attack. I think it's a bad precedent to set, which just allows nations to get away with horrific things if we're going to have an excuse that says they cannot be criticized at certain moments. If you're doing something wrong, you should be condemned. And this logic holds true about the Palestinian side, right? Many people say, how are you going to condemn Hamas? They're just oppressed. Okay, fine. They committed some war crimes, but in the big picture, they're just resisting. It's just a resistance movement, right? Palestinians have a similar argument to this. No, so I fundamentally disagree. I think if Hamas does something wrong, they commit war crimes, we should talk about it and hold them accountable. If Israel commits war crimes, we should talk about it and hold them accountable. And I understand the difference, the different perspective. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm simply sharing why I feel this is important. Another thing is, if those who love Israel and wish to see Israel thrive refuse to criticize Israel, then the narrative and the conversation around Israel's critique is led, determined, and dominated by those who wish to see Israel cease to exist. Think about that. When we refuse to criticize Israel, the narrative that is created around Israel's criticism is determined by those that wish to see Israel cease to exist. One clear example is how rampant claims of genocide have spread. Now, I think that if more pro-Israel advocates were to be honest and say, well, it's not genocide, but we're seeing horrific war crimes and crimes against humanity, we would actually be able to convince more people. And again, it's not like this is a positive thing to convince them of, but we would actually be able to shift the conversation towards one that is more accurate. And again, on the topic of genocide, I think it's a meaningless debate. I defer to the ICJ. Let the courts decide how they want to rule on this. When it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity, I mean, I think it's abundantly clear. But because very few pro-Israel advocates are talking about this, the prevailing narrative is that Israel is committing genocide. When we refuse to criticize Israel, we lose all credibility with those who we disagree with. My goal is not to be loved by as many pro-Israel people as possible. It's not to be loved by as many pro-Palestine people as possible. It's to bridge both sides, and it's to speak what I believe to be an important truth. Now, again, you don't need to agree with this approach. I'm not trying to convince you, but I think it's important to understand what drives me here. Hope that clarifies. I have a call in 8 minutes, so we can do 8 more minutes. Let's see. Louis L. Binger, good to see you here. Also a supporter of the channel. Floodland 9999 goes, Iran has nukes now. How does that fit his narrative? Has that been confirmed? I'm not sure. If it is, I guess I'm not surprised. All that means is we need to be even more dedicated to solving the conflict, knowing that Iran has the ability to end Israel by the push of a button, right? Because they proved that they can hit us with ballistic missiles, dozens upon dozens of them. They could overwhelm our systems. Those are all nuclear capable ballistic missiles. I don't think they're going to do that because it would be suicide for them. But even if there's a 1% chance they do it, that should be enough of a reason to understand that maintaining the status quo and continued conflict is not in our best interest. Cosmos goes, if you support the killing and bombing of children in Palestine, you lost your moral compass. Nothing justifies October 7th, but October 7th doesn't justify everything else. I think that's a good point. Nancy Fetterman, who's writing us from Facebook. Hey, Nancy. Adar, have you seen the documentary film about Rabbi Froman produced by Harvey Stein? I know Harvey Stein. He's a friend. Maybe people on the chat would appreciate getting a link to that film. I don't have it handy, but maybe you do. I don't have it handy, and I haven't seen it. But if you want to drop a link here, I'm sure people would be interested in seeing and learning more. Critical thinking, thank you for the support. He goes, I think Jews who carefully critique Israel's actions help the world know that we don't all unconditionally support anything Israel does. I think your work is what's needed in the world. Thank you. And I actually have been getting a few messages from Jews lately and pro-Israel people about this exact point that, and I get it, it's so challenging. It's like the world is against us. There's more anti-Israel hate than ever before. There's more anti-Semitism than any time in recent history. It makes us feel very, very defensive over our state, our people. So it seems like many people feel this crisis of, I don't want to add to I don't want to contribute to the hate Israel receives, but I don't feel comfortable sitting by idly and saying nothing about what we're seeing happen in Gaza, for example. So it seems like this is a certain crisis many Jews, diaspora Jews, and potentially Israelis are currently going through. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, for those interested in more, I've been talking a little bit about the death toll in Gaza and the civilian to combatant ratio and the war crimes being committed. So I'm putting together a very comprehensive report. I still haven't decided if I'm going to pre-record it or live stream it. But regardless, it's going to be filmed this week. Either I'm going to live stream it on Thursday or I'll pre-record it and maybe release it Monday or Tuesday. Interestingly, whenever I try to pre-record something, it just takes so much longer. Like when something's live, it's never perfect, but there's nothing I could do about it. You just got to keep rolling with it. When it's pre-recorded, I mess up, so I start again, and then I'm not in flow. I don't find the flow state when I do these pre-recorded ones. That's why I do very little pre-recorded content. Sometimes the occasional reel or two. Tikkun Olam, Isaac Lev says, hi back, brother. Good to see you here. We're just wrapping it up. Dun. Maybe we'll do one more question. Let's see. I think we lost Omri. Akil, are you still here? I'm pretty sure we spoke about this, but if not, it's definitely worth addressing. Aren't Palestinians also Semitic? Does that make Israel anti-Semitic? So Semitic is no longer used as a classification of people. Hold on, I'm getting a call. Don't call me on stream ever. So Semitic is no longer used as a category of people. It's a category of languages. But that's almost besides the point. Anti-Semitic does not mean anti-Semitic people. It means anti-Jewish. I know it's confusing, but that's what the term means. So being anti-Semitic means being anti-Jewish. So to say when somebody says, I can't be anti-Semitic, I am Semitic, it's what's the name of the fallacy? Is it an association fallacy where you use the same word with a different meaning? Logical fallacies are so important to know. I'm so bummed they didn't teach this to us in school because it's so much harder to retain as an adult. Like, this should be second nature. We should just be able to pick up fallacies, identify them, and know what they are in an instance. And as much as I haven't studied them extensively, but I still can't always know what they are. No, it's not an association fallacy. What's that fallacy? Equivocation fallacy? Maybe that's what it is. So when you use the word Semite, in that context, it's different than how it's being used in anti-Semite, right? So that's called an equivocation fallacy. Let me just check that. Equivocation fallacy. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, equivocation. In logic, equivocation is an informal fallacy resulting from the use of a particular word or expression in multiple senses within an argument. A type of ambiguity that stems from a phrase having two or more distinct meanings, not from the grammar or structure of the sentence, right? So it's an equivocation fallacy. Akil, and you respond respectfully, that's just BS to fit Jewish narrative. No, that's actually not. That is literally the meaning of the term anti-Semitic. There's because Semitic are not some group of people, there's no reason for there to be a term anti-Semitic people. It's not a term that's used. If you don't like Muslims, we say Islamophobic. If you're anti-Palestinian, you could say anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab. We have terms for these. And I could agree with you that probably the term anti-Jewish would be less confusing, but the term anti-Semitic means anti-Jewish. That's not even debatable. So this isn't bullshit to fit the Jewish narrative. This is me describing reality for what it is. If this reality for some reason makes you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. Facts don't care about your feelings, as a not so wise man once said. Calling again. Hold on a live stream. Oh, and it's 11:30. So with that, gotta wrap it up. Anyways, thank you all for tuning in. I will be back this week with another stream, most likely, or early next week with the report. Awesome. Love you all. See you soon. Thank you for joining.